Sometimes the deepest love begins with a stranger's letter written by candlelight in a lonely hall. Sometimes the hardest truth comes out at the worst possible moment, when hope feels within reach. Hroald the Giant spent months writing gentle words to Brynja, a woman from the eastern lands he'd never met. When she finally arrived at his hall, the welcome feast was grand. Tables full of food, warm firelight, and the promise of new love. But as the evening went on, the hall's skald stood to sing. What he shared wasn't a heroic tale, but a dark secret from Hroald's past, something the warrior had never told Brynja in all their letters. The music stopped. The hall fell silent. Brynja stood frozen, staring at the man she thought she knew. Every guest waited to see what would happen next. Would she run into the cold Norse night, or would she stay to learn what real love could build between two people who'd shared their hearts but hidden their truths? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The fjord stretched like a silver blade between towering cliffs, its waters reflecting the pale morning sun that struggled through the perpetual mist of the northern lands. Eldborg Hall stood on a rocky outcrop overlooking these waters, its timber walls weathered grey by countless seasons of salt, spray and winter storms. Smoke rose from the central hearth, carrying the scent of burning oak and roasted meat across the settlement below, where fishing boats bobbed at wooden piers and children played between the drying nets. This was Hroald's domain, earned through blood and held through respect. The hall itself told the story of his life, massive oak beams hewn from trees older than memory, walls decorated with shields bearing the marks of distant battles, and above the great hearth, his war-axe hung like a sleeping giant. The weapon was as tall as a man's chest, its iron head polished to a mirror, shined despite the nicks and scars that spoke of countless conflicts. Even at rest, it seemed to emanate a quiet menace, a reminder of the violence that had built this peaceful sanctuary. Hroald himself moved through his hall like a bear among cubs. At 6.5 feet tall, with shoulders that could block a doorway, he had earned his name honestly. His hair, once golden as summer wheat, now bore threads of silver that caught the firelight as he bent over the long oak table that dominated the hall's center. Scars crisscrossed his arms and hands, pale lines that mapped every battle he'd survived, every enemy he'd faced. The largest ran from his left temple to his jaw, a remembrance of a Saxon blade that had come closer to ending his story than he cared to recall. Yet for all his fearsome appearance, something gentle lived in his grey eyes. It showed itself in quiet moments, when he thought no one was watching, when he fed scraps to the hall's old hound, when he listened patiently to the complaints of his tenants, when he sat alone in the evening light, reading and rereading letters that had travelled farther than most warriors ever would. The correspondence had begun 2 winters past, born from loneliness and the growing certainty that a man could not live by war alone. His cousin Ragnar, who had sailed to the eastern lands on trading ventures, had spoken of women there educated, gentle, seeking good homes in the western fjords. Not like the shield maidens who had caught Hroald's eye in his youth, warriors in their own right, who had ultimately chosen men who could match them blade for blade. These Eastern women, Ragnar said, valued strength of character over strength of arm. The idea had taken root slowly, like a seed in winter soil. Hroald had spent the better part of a season learning to write with something approaching elegance, his massive fingers struggling to form letters delicate enough for courtship. His first attempts had looked like runes carved by a drunken giant, but practice and patience had gradually tamed his hand. When he finally sent that first letter, carried by traders bound for the settlements along the great rivers, he had felt more nervous than before any battle. At least in war, he knew the rules. Strength, speed, and cunning determined the outcome. In matters of the heart, especially when that heart must be won with words alone, he was as inexperienced as a boy holding his first sword. Brynja's response had arrived with the spring thaw, carried by the same traders who brought news of distant kingdoms and exotic goods. Her script was elegant and precise, each letter formed with the care of someone who had been taught to value words as tools of both beauty and power. She wrote of her life in the eastern lands, the daughter of a merchant who had prospered in the river trade but had died the previous winter, leaving her with few prospects and fewer protectors. What had captured Hroald's attention wasn't her circumstances, dire as they were, but the voice that lived in her words. She wrote of watching sunrise paint the river's gold, of the way migrating birds called to something wild in her spirit, of books she had read by candlelight while snow fell beyond her window. Her letters revealed a mind that sought beauty in small things, a heart that had known sorrow but had not grown bitter. Their correspondence had deepened through the long months that followed. Hroald found himself sharing things he had never spoken aloud, his doubts about the violent path that had shaped his early years, his dreams of building something lasting rather than simply conquering what others had built, his growing certainty that honor meant more than reputation. In return, Brynja shared her own dreams and fears. She wrote of her desire to build a true home, of her love for the old stories that spoke of heroes who protected rather than pillaged, of her hope that somewhere in the wide world lived a man who valued wisdom as much as warfare. Neither had spoken of love in those early letters, but something deeper than mere arrangement had grown between them. They had become friends across the vast distance, sharing thoughts and dreams that they had never entrusted to anyone else. When Hroald finally wrote to propose marriage, his words had been simple. "I have come to treasure your letters more than gold, your thoughts more than glory. If you would have me, I would spend my remaining years proving worthy of the trust you have already shown." Her acceptance had arrived with the first merchants of summer, along with word that she would travel with the autumn trading fleet. The months of waiting had been both torment and joy. Torment because each day stretched endlessly toward her arrival, joy because he could prepare for the life they would build together. The hall had been transformed under his direction. New tapestries hung from the walls, their rich colors warming the stone. The guest chamber had been fitted with the finest furnishings that silver could buy, a bed frame carved with intricate knotwork, furs soft enough for a queen, a writing desk where she could continue the letters that had brought them together. He had even commissioned a local craftsman to create a small library, knowing from her letters that books were among her greatest treasures. His retainers had watched these preparations with a mixture of amusement and respect. Gunnar, his old shield brother who had stood beside him in a dozen battles, had joked that he'd never seen a warrior prepare for love with the same intensity that he'd once brought to siege warfare. But even Gunnar's jokes carried affection. They all knew that their lord had been alone too long, and they welcomed the prospect of a lady who might bring laughter and children to the great hall. The other members of his household had thrown themselves into the preparations with equal enthusiasm. Astrid, the cook who had served his family for 30 years, had spent weeks planning the welcome feast, consulting with traders about Eastern spices and delicacies that might remind the bride of home. The young serving women had gathered flowers and greenery to decorate the hall, while the men had ensured that every surface gleamed with polish and every weapon hung in perfect order. As summer turned to autumn and the trading ships were sighted in the fjord, Hroald had felt something he had thought lost forever, genuine nervousness mixed with pure anticipation. He was a man who had faced death without flinching, who had led charges against overwhelming odds, who had negotiated peace treaties with rival jarls. Yet the prospect of meeting the woman whose letters had become the bright center of his days left him as uncertain as a green boy approaching his first battle. The morning of her arrival had dawned clear and cold, with frost painting the meadows silver and the fjord as smooth as polished steel. Hroald had risen before dawn, unable to sleep, and had walked the shores while his household made final preparations. He carried her latest letter in the leather pouch at his belt, the parchment worn soft from countless readings, her words promising arrival with the autumn fleet and a heart full of hope. When the ships appeared, their striped sails bright against the morning sky, his chest had tightened with an emotion he couldn't name. Somewhere aboard those vessels was the woman who had come to know his thoughts better than anyone living, who had seen past his reputation to the man who struggled to write gentle words by candlelight. The feast that evening would be magnificent, he knew. The tables would groan under the weight of roasted meat and fresh bread, mead would flow like water, and his skald would sing tales to honor their union. It would be a celebration worthy of a jarl's wedding, a night that would be remembered and spoken of in years to come. What Hroald could not have anticipated, what no amount of preparation could have prevented, was that among his guests sat one whose loyalty had curdled into malice, whose knowledge of old secrets ran deeper than friendship should allow. The skald who would rise to sing that night carried more than tales of glory. He carried the power to unravel everything that gentle letters had built between two hearts that had learned to trust across impossible distance. The war axe hanging above the hearth caught the firelight as servants made final preparations for the feast. It would witness what unfolded that night, as it had witnessed so much else, a silent guardian of secrets that some believed should never be buried, no matter how much pain their revelation might cause. The trading ship rounded the last bend of the fjord, just as the afternoon sun broke through the gathering clouds, casting golden light across its weathered hull and striped sail. From his position on the wooden pier, Hroald felt his heart hammer against his ribs, a sensation he hadn't experienced since his first battle, decades past. Somewhere aboard that vessel was the woman whose letters had transformed his understanding of what life might hold. The ship's captain, a grizzled trader named Olaf, whom Hroald had known for years, called out greetings as his crew secured the vessel to the pier. But Hroald's attention was fixed on the small group of passengers gathering near the gangplank. He spotted her immediately, though she looked nothing like the image his imagination had constructed during those long months of correspondence. Brynja was smaller than he had expected, with dark hair braided in the Eastern fashion and clothing that spoke of both practicality and modest prosperity. Her traveling cloak was well made but worn from the journey, and she carried herself with the careful dignity of someone accustomed to being the only woman in unfamiliar company. When their eyes met across the narrow strip of water still separating ship from shore, Hroald saw something that made his chest tighten, uncertainty mixed with determined hope. The moment she stepped onto the pier, the world seemed to shift around them. Up close, he could see the intelligence that had lived in her letters reflected in dark eyes that took in everything: his size, his scars, the way his household had gathered to witness this meeting. She was beautiful, but in a way that spoke more of character than mere physical grace. Life had marked her, as it marked everyone who survived to see 30 summers, but it had not diminished the spirit that had reached across continents through carefully crafted words. "Lady Brynja," he said, inclining his head in a formal bow that felt both necessary and absurd given the intimacy of their correspondence. "Welcome to Eldborg." Her answering smile was genuine, though he could see nervousness in the way her hands gripped the leather satchel that contained her few possessions. "Lord Hroald, your letters spoke truly of this place. It's more beautiful than I imagined." The formality felt strange after months of sharing their deepest thoughts on parchment, but Hroald understood that they needed time to reconcile the people they had become in letters with the flesh and blood reality standing before them. He offered his arm, and after a moment's hesitation, she accepted it. Even through the thick wool of his sleeve, he could feel her trembling slightly, whether from cold, exhaustion, or nervousness. He couldn't tell. The walk to the hall passed in careful conversation. She asked about the settlement, the fjord, the mountains that rose like sleeping giants beyond the water. He found himself speaking more freely than he had expected, pointing out landmarks and sharing stories of how this place had become home. Her responses showed the quick wit he had come to treasure in her letters, but underneath the polite exchange, both of them were clearly struggling with the strangeness of finally meeting in person. His household had prepared for her arrival with genuine warmth. Astrid, the cook, greeted her with maternal kindness and immediately began fussing over the travel-stained condition of her clothes. The serving women offered to prepare a bath and lay out fresh garments. Gunnar and the other men kept a respectful distance, but watched with obvious approval as she thanked each person by name clearly. She had paid attention to the details Hroald had shared in his letters about the people who made Eldborg a home rather than merely a stronghold. The chamber prepared for her drew a soft gasp of surprise and pleasure. The carved bed frame, the writing desk positioned to catch the morning light, the small collection of books he had acquired from traveling merchants, everything reflected months of careful thought about what would make her comfortable. For the first time since stepping off the ship, her smile reached her eyes. Completely. "You remembered," she said, running her fingers along the smooth wood of the desk. "In one of your letters, I mentioned how much I missed having a place to write." "I remember everything you've written," Hroald replied, then immediately worried that he sounded too intense, too eager. But Brynja's expression softened, and for a moment the strange awkwardness between them eased. The afternoon passed more smoothly as she rested and refreshed herself, while the hall buzzed with preparations for the evening's feast. Hroald found himself checking and rechecking arrangements that had already been perfected, his nervous energy seeking outlet in activity. Gunnar finally cornered him near the stables, where he was inspecting harness that needed no inspection. "She's lovely," his old friend said without preamble. "And she clearly has sense. I saw her talking with Astrid about the household management, asking intelligent questions. She'll do well here. Assuming she chooses to." "Stay," Hroald replied, voicing the fear that had been gnawing at him all afternoon. "Why wouldn't she? The arrangements were made honorably. She's traveled half the world to be here, and you've prepared for her like you were planning a campaign." Gunnar paused, studying his friend's face. "Unless there's something you haven't told her?" The question hit closer to home than Gunnar could have known. There were indeed things Hroald hadn't shared in his letters, not from deliberate deception, but because some truths seemed too dark for the gentle intimacy they had built through words. His past held shadows that even his closest friends rarely mentioned, choices made in the heat of war that he had spent years trying to forget. "Nothing that matters now," he said finally, but the words felt hollow even to his own ears. Evening came with the scent of roasted meat and the sound of voices raised in anticipation. The great hall had been transformed for the occasion, torches blazed in, their sconces casting dancing shadows on the tapestried walls, while the long tables groaned under the weight of the finest feast Astrid had ever prepared. Mead flowed freely, and the air hummed with the excited conversation of guests who had gathered from settlements throughout the fjord to witness their lord's wedding celebration. Brynja entered the hall, wearing a dress of deep blue wool that Hroald's coin had purchased from traders months before. She had clearly been uncertain about its fit, but the seamstresses had worked miracles in the few hours available to them. She looked like a queen, dignified and beautiful, though Hroald could see in her eyes that she was overwhelmed by the crowd of strangers raising their cups in her honor. He stood to welcome her formally before the assembled guests, and the hall fell silent with expectation. This was the moment that would mark the beginning of their new life together, the first time they would appear before the world as intended, husband and wife. His prepared words, carefully rehearsed, spoke of honor and welcome, of the hope that her presence would bring blessing to his house and hall. Her response was gracious and appropriate, thanking his household for their kindness and expressing gratitude for the welcome she had received. But even as she spoke, Hroald noticed a figure at the far end of the hall, Bjorn the skald, whom he had commissioned to provide entertainment for the evening. The man's expression was strange, calculating in a way that sent a chill down Hroald's spine. Bjorn was known throughout the northern lands for his skill with both harp and voice, capable of moving listeners to tears or laughter with equal ease. He was also known for his pride and his long memory traits that served him well in his profession, but had sometimes made him a dangerous friend. Tonight, something in his manner suggested that he carried more than heroic tales to share with the assembled guests. As the feast progressed and the mead loosened tongues, Hroald found his attention splitting between the woman beside him and the skald across the hall. Brynja was doing well, engaging in polite conversation with his guests and showing genuine interest in their lives and concerns. She had the gift of making people feel heard, a quality that would serve her well as the Lady of Eldborg. But Bjorn remained silent, watching and waiting with the patience of a man who knew that the most powerful songs were those delivered at precisely the right moment. When the skald finally rose and called for silence, the hall hushed with anticipation. Entertainment was expected at such gatherings, and Bjorn's reputation promised something memorable. What no one anticipated was that the tale he chose to tell would shatter the careful peace that Hroald had built around his past, bringing old sins into the light before the woman whose trust had become more precious to him than life itself. The silence that followed, Bjorn's rise stretched like the moment between lightning and thunder. Hroald felt the weight of every eye in the hall, felt the expectant hush that preceded the skald's performance, and wished desperately that he had chosen a different man to provide the evening's entertainment. But it was too late now. Bjorn held the gathered crowd's attention like a master archer drawing back his bow. "Lords and ladies," Bjorn began, his voice carrying the practiced cadence that could fill even the largest hall. "Tonight we celebrate not merely a union, but the joining of two souls who have found each other across great distance. Such love deserves a tale worthy of its depth." Relief flooded through Hroald as the opening words suggested a traditional celebration of romance and heroism. Perhaps his instincts had been wrong. Perhaps Bjorn intended nothing more than the conventional entertainment expected at such gatherings. "But what makes a man worthy of such devotion?" the skald continued, and Hroald's relief began to curdle into apprehension. "What trials forge the character that draws a noble heart across continents?" Brynja leaned forward slightly, her attention caught by the promise of learning more about the man whose letters had won her affection. Around the hall, guests settled into comfortable anticipation of heroic deeds and glorious victories. This was the moment when a skilled skald would weave together truth and legend, creating a tale that honored both host and guest while entertaining the assembled company. "Let me tell you," Bjorn said, his fingers finding the strings of his harp, "of the winter when our Lord earned his name not through strength of arm, but through strength of will." The story that followed was masterfully told, too masterfully, Hroald realized with growing dread. Bjorn spoke of a harsh winter 5 years past, when raiders from the eastern shores had swept down upon coastal settlements like wolves upon sheep. The skald painted vivid pictures of burning farmsteads and terrified villagers, of desperate messages carried through snow and ice to reach Eldborg and its mighty lord. Thus far, the tale followed familiar patterns. Hroald's response to such threats was well known and generally admired: swift, decisive action that put an end to raiding before it could spread. He had indeed ridden out that winter with a hand-picked band of warriors, tracking the raiders to their temporary stronghold on a windswept island. But as Bjorn's voice wove through the familiar story, Hroald began to recognize subtle changes in tone and emphasis. The skald lingered on details that most storytellers would pass over quickly: the fear in the raiders' eyes when they realized they were trapped, the way the winter storm had cut off any hope of escape, the methodical nature of Hroald's assault on their position. "And when the leader of these sea-wolves knelt before our Lord," Bjorn continued, his harp providing an ominous counterpoint to Bjorn of Plies, his words, "he begged for mercy." He spoke of a daughter waiting for his return, of a wife who had already lost 2 sons to the sea. He offered ransom, submission, anything that might purchase life. The hall had grown strangely quiet. This level of detail was unusual in heroic tales, which typically focused on glory and triumph rather than the human cost of victory. Brynja's attention was completely fixed on the skald now, and Hroald could see questions forming in her dark eyes. What does a true lord do in such moments? Bjorn asked rhetorically, his gaze finding Hroald across the smoky air. How does he balance justice with mercy? How does he weigh the lives lost against the lives that might be saved? Hroald's mouth had gone dry. He knew where this story was heading now, knew the choice that Bjorn was about to reveal to the assembled guests. It had been a decision made in the heat of anger and righteous fury, a choice that had haunted his dreams for years afterward. Our Lord looked upon this raider who had burned homes and murdered innocents, the skald continued relentlessly. He thought of the children who would never see their father's return, of the wives who had perished defending their hearths. And he made the choice that justice demanded. The euphemism was skillfully crafted, but everyone in the hall understood its meaning. Justice, in this context, meant death not just for the leader, but for all his men. It meant the systematic execution of prisoners who had surrendered, who had begged for their lives, who had offered everything they possessed in exchange for mercy. Brynja had gone very still beside him. Her hands, which had been resting lightly on the table, now gripped the edge of the wood with white-knuckled intensity. She was no sheltered maiden. Her letters had revealed a woman who understood the harsh realities of their world, but understanding the necessity of violence and witnessing its cold celebration were very different things. And so winter's justice was served, Bjorn concluded, with a flourish of his harp. The raiders paid the price for their crimes, and peace returned to our shores. Such is the strength of will that protects all who shelter beneath Eldborg's roof. The applause that followed was uncertain, scattered. The guests understood that they had witnessed something unusual, a tale that skated the edge between celebration and condemnation. Bjorn's skill had presented the facts in terms that were not quite accusatory, but neither were they the glorious endorsement typically expected at such gatherings. Hroald forced himself to acknowledge the performance with a nod, though his throat felt too tight for words. Beside him, Brynja sat in silence, processing what she had heard. The rest of the evening's festivities continued around them. Conversation gradually resumed, more mead was poured, other entertainments were offered, but the easy joy had leaked out of the celebration like air from a punctured bladder. When Brynja finally spoke, her voice was carefully controlled. "That was quite a tale. Is it true?" "Yes," Hroald replied simply. There was no point in denial or evasion. If their relationship was to survive this revelation, it would have to be built on truth, however painful. "All of it?" "All of it," she nodded slowly, still staring straight ahead rather than looking at him. "I see." Those two words carried the weight of judgment, though Hroald couldn't tell whether that judgment was condemnation or simply a woman trying to reconcile the gentle correspondent she had come to love with the harsh reality of the man sitting beside her. The remainder of the feast passed in a blur of strained normalcy. Guests who had witnessed the exchange between lord and lady spoke in hushed tones among themselves, clearly uncertain about what they had observed. Some seemed to approve of Bjorn's bold storytelling, viewing it as an honest tribute to their lord's strength. Others appeared uncomfortable with the skald's choice to emphasize the darker aspects of a story that could have been told as straightforward heroism. When the evening finally ended and the guests began to depart, Hroald found himself walking beside Brynja toward the guest chamber in silence. The woman whose letters had filled his days with warmth now felt like a stranger, and he had no idea how to bridge the sudden chasm that had opened between them. At her door, she paused without looking at him. "Thank you for the evening." It was illuminating. The word hung in the air between them like a blade, sharp with meanings he was afraid to examine too closely. Dawn came grey and cold to Eldborg, matching the mood that had settled over the hall like morning mist. Hroald had spent the night pacing his chamber, sleep driven away by the memory of Brynja's final word, illuminating, and the careful way she had avoided his eyes when she spoke it. He had faced enemy armies with more composure. than he could muster for the prospect of facing the woman whose opinion had come to matter more than his own life. From his window he could see the fjord stretching toward the horizon, its waters choppy under the influence of an autumn wind that carried the promise of winter. Trading ships still dotted the harbor, their crews preparing for the final voyages before the seas grew too dangerous for all but the most desperate or foolish. One of those ships could carry Brynja back to her homeland if she chose to leave. A thought that made his chest tight with something approaching panic. A soft knock at his door interrupted his brooding. "Enter," he called, expecting Gunnar or one of his retainers with the morning's business. Instead, Astrid stepped into the chamber, her weathered face wearing an expression of maternal concern that he had known since boyhood. "She's awake," the cook announced without preamble. "Been awake for hours," from the sound of it, heard her moving about, before first light. "Is she?" Hroald began, then stopped, unsure what question he actually wanted to ask. "Packing?" "No." "Writing?" "Yes. Been at that desk you had made for her since before dawn, from what the girls tell me." Astrid moved to straighten his already tidy chamber with the automatic movements of long habit. "Whatever she's putting on that parchment, it's taken 3 attempts. Found 2 crumpled pages in the fire grate when I went to check on her. The image of Brynja struggling with her words, something she had never done in her letters to him, sent another stab of worry through his chest. In all their correspondence, her writing had flowed with elegant precision, each letter crafted with obvious care, but arriving complete and polished. The thought of her starting and stopping, searching for words that wouldn't come, suggested an internal struggle that matched his own. Has she asked about arrangements for departing? Haven't spoken of leaving at all? Haven't spoken much of anything? Truth be told. Thanked the girls for their service, complimented yesterday's meal, asked about the weather. Astrid fixed him with the look that had quelled his boyhood misbehavior more effectively than any punishment. "She's thinking, not fleeing. There's a difference." The distinction offered small comfort. In his experience, thinking could be more dangerous than fleeing. Emotion might drive someone away in haste, but rational consideration could build walls that no amount of regret could breach. An hour later, he found himself standing outside her chamber, his hand raised to knock but frozen by uncertainty. What did a man say to the woman whose trust he might have destroyed through the accident of an old enemy's malice? How did he explain choices made in the heat of anger and righteous fury to someone whose letters had revealed a soul that valued mercy as much as justice? Before he could decide whether to knock or retreat, the door opened. Brynja stood in the threshold, fully dressed and composed, though he could see signs of sleeplessness in the shadows beneath her dark eyes. She held a folded piece of parchment in her hands, the latest attempt at whatever letter had occupied her morning. "I was about to come looking for you," she said simply. "We need to talk." They walked to the small alcove overlooking the fjord, where she had admired the view the previous afternoon. In daylight, the beauty of the setting seemed almost mocking all that peaceful splendor, existing in stark contrast to the tension that stretched between them like a bowstring. "I've been trying to write to my cousin," Brynja began without preamble, settling onto the wooden bench that faced the water. "She's the only family I have left, the only one who knew about my journey here. I thought I should tell her about my arrival, about what I've found." Hroald remained standing, his hands clasped behind his back in unconscious imitation of the military bearing that had shaped so much of his life. "And what have you found?" "That's what I've been struggling to put into words." She unfolded the parchment, staring down at whatever she had managed to write. "How do you explain to someone that the man whose letters taught you about gentleness and honor is also capable of—" She paused, searching for the right words. "Of what Bjorn described last night? You could explain that war requires choices that peace cannot understand," Hroald offered, though the words felt hollow even as he spoke them. "I could. But that would be making excuses for you, and I don't think that's what either of us needs right now." She looked up at him, and he saw something in her expression that surprised him, not condemnation, but a kind of determined honesty that reminded him powerfully of her letters. "Tell me about that winter," not the version Bjorn told, not the justification or the politics. "Tell me what happened in your own words." The request was fair, though it felt like being asked to cut open an old wound that had never properly healed. Hroald took a seat on the opposite end of the bench, leaving space between them that felt both respectful and symbolic of the distance that had opened in their relationship. "The raids had been going on for weeks," he began, his voice carefully controlled. "Not the usual smash-and-run attacks we occasionally saw, but systematic strikes that spoke of planning and local knowledge. They knew which farms would be lightly defended, which households held the most valuable goods, which routes would let them escape before any organized response could reach them." Brynja listened in silence as he described the escalating violence, the desperate messages from outlying settlements, the pressure from his own people to act decisively. He found himself speaking more freely than he had expected, perhaps because her letters had accustomed him to sharing difficult truths with her. "When we finally cornered them on that island, they had nowhere to run. The storm that trapped them also trapped us. We couldn't leave, even if we had wanted to." He stared out at the fjord, seeing not the peaceful morning scene but the ice-locked channel of that terrible winter. "Their leader did exactly what Bjorn described. He begged for mercy, offered ransom, spoke of family waiting for his return. And you refused. I executed them all. Every man who had raised sword against innocence, every raider who had burned homes and taken lives." The words came out flat, matter-of-fact, stripped of either justification or regret. "I told myself it was justice. I told myself it was necessary to prevent future raids. I told myself many things, but you've never stopped thinking about it." "No." The days that followed settled into an uneasy routine that felt nothing like the comfortable domesticity Hroald had imagined during those long months of correspondence. Brynja remained at Eldborg, a choice that brought him both relief and anxiety, but their interactions had taken on the careful politeness of strangers, sharing an inn rather than the warmth of intended spouses, learning to build a life together. She spent her mornings exploring the settlement and its surroundings, often accompanied by one of the serving women, but clearly seeking solitude for her thoughts. Hroald watched from distance as she walked the shores of the fjord or climbed the paths that led to the high meadows overlooking the hall. Her movements had a restless quality that spoke of internal wrestling, of a mind working through problems that had no easy solutions. In the afternoons, she often sat in the alcove with the writing desk he had commissioned, working on letters that she never seemed to finish. The pile of discarded attempts had grown large enough that Astrid had begun collecting them for the kitchen fires, though not before Hroald caught glimpses of familiar handwriting wrestling with words that refused to come. Their conversations, when they occurred, focused on practical matters with painful politeness. She asked intelligent questions about the management of the settlement, the seasonal rhythms of life in the northern fjords, the relationships between Eldborg and its neighbours. He answered thoroughly, grateful for neutral topics, but aware that they were both avoiding the deeper issues that lay between them like an undrawn blade. On the third morning after the feast, Gunnar finally cornered him in the armory, where he had been conducting unnecessary maintenance on weapons that already gleamed with perfect care. "This can't continue," his old friend said without preamble, settling onto a nearby bench with the authority of someone who had earned the right to speak plainly. "You're prowling around this hall like a caged bear, and she's walking those paths like a woman trying to find her way out of a maze. Neither of you is eating properly, neither of you is sleeping well, and the entire household is starting to walk on eggshells." Hroald looked up from the sword he had been polishing for the third time that morning. "She hasn't asked to leave." "No, but she hasn't unpacked her travelling chest either. Astrid tells me everything is still folded and ready, like she's prepared to make a decision at any moment." Gunnar leaned forward, his scarred hands clasped between his knees. What exactly did you tell her about that business on the island? The truth. All of it? Including why you made the choice you did? The question caught Hroald off guard. In the years since that winter, he had told himself that his decision had been born purely of justice and necessity, a harsh but required response to brutal criminality. But Gunnar's knowing look suggested that his old shield brother remembered details that Hroald had tried to forget. I told her about the executions, about refusing mercy to men who had surrendered, but did you tell her about Sigrid? The name hit Hroald like a physical blow. Sigrid, the young woman from a coastal settlement who had been among the raiders' victims, found dead in the ruins of her family's farm with injuries that spoke of prolonged suffering before merciful death finally came. The discovery of her body had been what transformed Hroald's methodical pursuit of justice into something much darker and more personal. That has nothing to do with... It has everything to do with it, Gunnar interrupted firmly. You didn't execute those men because military doctrine demanded it. You executed them because you found that girl's body and lost your mind with rage. There's a difference between cold justice and hot vengeance, and she deserves to know which one she's judging you for. The truth in those words was like salt in an old wound. Hroald had indeed been thinking of Sigrid when he ordered the executions, thinking of her shy smile, her gentle manner with injured animals, the way she had looked forward to her upcoming marriage to a young farmer from the next valley. The raiders hadn't just killed her, they had destroyed her so thoroughly that even her father hadn't been able to identify her remains with certainty. Telling her that makes it worse, not better, Hroald said finally. Personal vengeance is harder to justify than military necessity. Maybe. Or maybe she needs to understand that you're not some cold-blooded killer who executes prisoners out of policy. Maybe she needs to know that you're a man who loved that girl like a daughter and lost himself when you found what had been done to her. That afternoon, Hroald found Brynja in the small garden behind the hall, tending to the late-blooming herbs that Astrid used for cooking and healing. She had rolled up her sleeves despite the autumn chill, and dirt smudged her hands as she worked to harvest the last useful plants before the first killing frost. The domestic scene stirred something in his chest, a vision of what their life together might have been if circumstances had been different. She looked up at his approach, wariness flickering across her features, before settling back into careful politeness. "The sage is still good," she said, holding up a bundle of silvery leaves. "Astrid says it will help preserve meat through the winter months. There's something else I need to tell you about that winter," he said without preamble. "Something I left out." Her hands stilled in their work, and he saw her shoulders tense slightly. "Go on." He told her about Sigrid then, about the bright young woman who had been like a niece to him, about finding her body in the ruins of the farmstead, about the way grief and rage had combined into something that obliterated his usual careful judgment. The words came haltingly at first, then in a rush, as emotions he had buried for years rose to the surface. "I didn't execute those men because military doctrine demanded it," he concluded. "I executed them because I looked at what they had done to someone I loved, and I wanted them to suffer the way she had suffered. It wasn't justice, it was revenge, pure and simple." Brynja had listened in silence, her dark eyes never leaving his face. When he finished, she set down the herbs and wiped her hands clean on a piece of rough cloth. "Thank you for telling me that. Does it change anything?" "It changes everything," she replied, though her tone made it impossible to tell whether that change was for better or worse. "A man seeking vengeance for a murdered daughter is very different from a man who kills prisoners as a matter of policy. I'm not sure which one I can live with, but at least now I understand what I'm trying to decide." The honesty in her voice was both painful and somehow comforting. At least, they were finally talking about the real issues that lay between them, rather than dancing around them with careful politeness. The revelation about Sigrid seemed to break some invisible dam between them. Over the following days, their conversations gradually moved beyond careful politeness towards something approaching the honesty that had characterized their letters. It wasn't comfort, not yet, but it was progress toward understanding, and Hroald found himself cautiously hopeful that they might eventually find their way back to the connection they had built through words alone. Brynja began joining him for the evening meal in the great hall rather than taking her food in solitary dignity. Their talk ranged over safer topics, books she had read, places she had travelled with her merchant father, the differences between Eastern and Western customs. But underneath these surface conversations, Hroald could sense her continued wrestling with the fundamental question of whether she could build a life with a man whose past contained such darkness. It was during one of these evening conversations that an unexpected visitor arrived at Eldborg's gates. The lookouts called down that a small party approached under banners of peace, 3 riders, travel-stained and clearly urgent about their business. Hroald excused himself to meet them in the courtyard, but Brynja rose to follow, her curiosity overcoming the careful distance she had maintained since the feast. The leader of the small party was a young man Hroald recognized as Leif, eldest son of Thorvald Ironbeard, who held lands 2 days' ride to the south. The boy, for at barely 20 summers, he still seemed very young despite his attempts at adult dignity, dismounted with obvious relief at reaching journey's end. "Lord Hroald," Leif said, offering a bow that spoke of genuine respect tinged with desperate hope. "I bring word from my father and a request for aid that I pray you will not refuse." The formal phrasing suggested serious trouble. Hroald gestured for the young man to continue, noting the exhaustion in his face and the lathered condition of the horses. Whatever had driven Leif to ride hard through autumn, weather was urgent indeed. "Raiders again," Leif said simply, "different from the ones you dealt with 5 winters past, but following the same pattern. They struck 3 settlements in our lands over the past 2 weeks, systematic, brutal, and gone before any organized response could reach them." Hroald felt something cold settle in his stomach. The raiding season should have been ending as autumn turned toward winter, not beginning. Most sea-wolves preferred easier targets in warmer weather, when storms were less likely to trap them far from home. How many ships? What banners? At least 2 longships, possibly 3. No banners we recognized, and the survivors' descriptions suggest they're not from any nearby lands. Their leader, Leif paused, glancing uncertainly at Brynja before continuing. Their leader leaves a particular calling card. At each settlement they've struck, they've left 1 survivor alive specifically to carry word of what happened. "Survivors are good," Brynja said quietly. "It means someone can identify them, track their movements, understand their methods." Leif's expression grew darker. "These survivors aren't left alive out of mercy, my lady. They're left alive to spread terror. Each one has been marked in ways that will prevent them from ever forgetting what they witnessed." The implications were clear enough. These weren't ordinary raiders seeking quick wealth, but something far more dangerous, men who enjoyed the work itself as much as its rewards. Such groups were rare, but when they emerged, they tended to leave devastation in their wake that lasted for generations. "What does your father ask of me?" Hroald said, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "He asks that you do what you did before, track them down, and end their raiding permanently. He offers half of everything recovered from their ships as payment, plus a formal alliance between our houses." Leif straightened, trying to project confidence, despite his obvious youth. "And he asked me to remind you that Sigrid was not the only innocent lost to raiders' cruelty." The mention of Sigrid's name sent a visible shock through both Hroald and Brynja. Clearly, the story of that winter's events had spread farther than Hroald had realized, becoming the sort of cautionary tale that leaders use to motivate each other toward decisive action. "My father says these new raiders are worse than the ones you dealt with before," Leif continued. "They don't just kill and steal, they seem to take pleasure in causing as much suffering as possible before they move on. The survivors' testimony suggests they may be planning something larger, using these small strikes to map the coastal defenses before attempting a major assault." Hroald found himself thinking tactically, despite his personal turmoil. The pattern Leif described was indeed familiar not from his own experience, but from stories told by men who had served in the great wars of previous generations. It suggested raiders who were either very experienced or very desperate, neither of which boded well for the coastal settlements. "I'll need to see the attack sites myself," he said finally. "Talk to the survivors, examine the patterns, understand what we're dealing with before making any plans." "Of course. My father hoped you would say that." Leif's relief was obvious. "He's prepared guides and supplies for whatever expedition you choose to mount." It was only then that Hroald realized the position this request placed him in. Brynja had come to Eldborg seeking a life with a man she hoped had left violence behind, only to discover that his past contained darker chapters than his letters had revealed. Now, barely a week after that revelation, circumstances were conspiring to drag him back into the very world she was struggling to accept. He turned to look at her, trying to read her expression. She stood very still, her dark eyes moving between him and Leif as she processed what she had heard. When she spoke, her voice was carefully controlled. "How long would such an expedition take?" "Impossible to say," Hroald answered honestly. "Tracking raiders is unpredictable work. It could be days or weeks, depending on how far they've ranged and whether they're still in local waters." She nodded slowly, and he saw her hands clasped together in front of her, a gesture he had begun to recognize as a sign that she was working through some internal conflict. "And if you refuse? If you choose not to go?" The question hung in the air between them like a test, though whether she was testing his character or her own ability to accept it was unclear. Leif watched this exchange with obvious confusion, clearly not understanding the undercurrents that swirled around his simple request for military aid. "Then the raids continue," Hroald said simply. "Other settlements burn, other innocents die, other men like Thorvald send desperate messages seeking help that may never come." "I see," Brynja said, and in those two words Hroald heard the weight of a decision being made. The morning preparations for departure had taken on the familiar rhythm that Hroald remembered from countless military campaigns. Weapons were sharpened and packed, supplies calculated and loaded, men briefed on the mission ahead. Gunnar supervised the practical arrangements while Hroald focused on the strategic considerations: routes to take, allies to contact, contingencies to prepare for whatever they might encounter. Brynja had risen before dawn to see them off, despite his suggestion that such formality wasn't necessary. She stood in the courtyard now, wrapped in a heavy cloak against the autumn chill, watching the final preparations with an expression that revealed nothing of her thoughts. Their conversation the previous evening had been careful and polite, focused on practical matters like how long he expected to be gone and what arrangements she preferred for her comfort during his absence. What they hadn't discussed, what hung between them like an unspoken question, was whether she would still be at Eldborg when he returned. The travelling chest in her chamber remained packed and ready, though she had given no indication of intending to leave. The uncertainty was perhaps worse than open rejection would have been, leaving him to wonder throughout the coming expedition whether he was fighting to protect a home that might be empty upon his return. "Lord Hroald," a voice called from the gates, interrupting his brooding. One of the lookouts was gesturing toward the fjord, where a small boat was approaching under oars. Single rider, flying Thorvald's banners. The boat reached the pier quickly, and its passenger proved to be another of Thorvald's sons, Eric, the middle child, whose reputation for level-headedness had made him his father's most trusted messenger. He dismounted from the boat with obvious urgency, barely pausing to secure his craft before striding up the path toward the hall. "Lord Hroald," Eric called out as soon as he spotted the gathered party. "Thank the gods you haven't left yet. I bring word that changes everything." The young man's face was flushed with exertion and excitement, but also something else, a kind of grim satisfaction that suggested unexpected developments. Hroald gestured for him to continue, noting that Brynja had moved closer to hear whatever news Eric carried. "We found their base," Eric announced without preamble. "The raiders, we know where they've been sheltering between attacks. And more importantly, we know who their leader is." The news sent a ripple of interest through the assembled warriors, but Hroald felt a chill of apprehension. In his experience, knowing an enemy's identity was as often a curse as a blessing, particularly when that knowledge came unexpectedly. "Go on," he said simply. Eric glanced around at the gathered crowd, then seemed to decide that the news was too important for discretion. "Their leader is Ivar Skullsplitter, and he's not here for random raiding, he's here for you." The name hit Hroald like a physical blow. Ivar Skullsplitter had been presumed dead for more than a decade, lost in a failed raid against the Irish coast, according to the last reports. He had also been the younger brother of Ragnar Redhand, the leader of the raiding party that Hroald had executed on that storm-locked island 5 winters past. "Are you certain?" Hroald asked, though he suspected the answer even as he spoke. The pattern of the raids, the systematic cruelty, the way the attacks had focused on settlements within striking distance of Eldborg, it all made terrible sense if the goal was not wealth, but revenge. One of the survivors recognized him from the old days, Eric confirmed. Henrik the fisherman, who sailed with trading fleets when he was younger. He swears on his mother's grave that it was Ivar who led the attack on his village. Gunnar was the first to voice what everyone was thinking. If Ivar is alive and leading these raids, then this isn't about protecting the coastal settlements. It's about settling an old blood debt. The implications were staggering. Everything about the situation had just changed, transforming what had seemed like a straightforward military problem into something far more personal and dangerous. Ivar Skullsplitter was not just any raider, he was one of the most cunning and vicious sea wolves of his generation, a man whose reputation for cruelty had been legendary, even among the brutal company he kept. "There's more," Eric continued, clearly steeling himself to deliver even worse news. "Our scouts found his base camp on Raven Island, about 2 days' sail north of here. He's got at least 30 men with him, maybe more, and they've been preparing for something bigger than raids. They've built proper fortifications, stockpiled supplies for a long siege, and," he paused, looking directly at Hroald. "They've been asking questions about Eldborg's defenses, specific questions about guard rotations, weak points in the walls, how many warriors you keep in the hall." The blood seemed to drain from Brynja's face as the full meaning of Eric's words became clear. This wasn't about Hroald leaving to hunt down raiders in distant waters. This was about raiders who were planning to come to him, who had already begun preparing to assault Eldborg itself. "How long do we have?" Hroald asked, his mind already shifting into the tactical mode that had served him through decades of warfare. "Hard to say. Our scouts think they're still gathering men and supplies, probably waiting for the right weather window. But it could be days or weeks before they move." Hroald felt the familiar weight of command settling over him, the burden of decisions that would determine not just his own fate, but the lives of everyone who looked to him for protection. The irony was, bitter Brynja had come here seeking refuge from a harsh world, only to find herself at the center of a conflict that existed solely because of his past choices. "We can't wait for them to come to us," Gunnar said grimly. "Eldborg is strong, but not against a determined siege by experienced warriors. Our best chance is to strike first, catch them before they're fully prepared. That means leaving the hall defenseless," one of the other warriors pointed out. "If this is a trap, if there are other forces we don't know about, then we're dead either way," Gunnar replied bluntly. "At least this way we have a chance to control the terms of the fight." Throughout this exchange, Brynja had remained silent, but Hroald could see the thoughts working behind her dark eyes. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady despite the gravity of what she had learned. "This is about me, isn't it? About my presence here?" The question caught everyone off guard. Hroald started to deny it. "But," she continued before he could speak, Ivar could have struck at any time over the past 5 years if his goal was simple revenge for his brother's death. But he waited until now, until after your bride arrived, until after you had something new to lose. Her voice grew harder as the logic became clear. He doesn't just want to kill you. He wants to take everything that matters to you first. The truth in her words was undeniable and terrible. Ivar Skull Splitter was not just a raider seeking vengeance, he was a predator who understood that the deepest wounds were not always physical. By waiting until Hroald had opened his heart to the possibility of love and happiness, Ivar had ensured that any victory would be as complete as possible. "If I leave," Brynja said quietly, "if I take the next trading ship back to the eastern lands, does that change his plans?" "No," Hroald replied immediately. "If anything, it makes them more likely to succeed. A man with nothing left to lose fights differently than one who still has hope." She nodded slowly, and he saw something change in her expression, a hardening of resolve that reminded him powerfully of her letters, of the quiet strength that had drawn him to her across impossible distance. "Then I stay," she said simply, "and we face whatever comes together." The declaration hung in the morning air like a battle cry, transforming the entire character of the conflict ahead. This was no longer just about settling old debts or protecting distant settlements. It had become about defending the fragile possibility of love against forces that sought to destroy it before it could fully bloom. Hroald looked at the woman whose letters had taught him to hope for something beyond war and violence, who was now prepared to stand beside him as enemies gathered in the northern waters. The artifact that defined this moment was not any physical object, but the choice itself, her decision to bind her fate to his, despite everything she had learned about the darkness in his past. The transformation of Eldborg from peaceful hall to fortress happened with the swift efficiency of men who had lived through war before. Within hours of Eric's revelation, the entire character of the settlement had shifted. Children who had been playing in the courtyard that morning were now helping their mothers prepare supplies for siege, while every able-bodied man worked to strengthen defenses that had been maintained more for tradition than necessity. Hroald stood atop the hall's highest tower, surveying the preparations with the cold assessment that had served him through decades of conflict. The timber walls that surrounded the settlement were strong, but not impregnable, adequate against casual raiders, but potentially vulnerable to a sustained assault by experienced warriors. The harbour offered excellent visibility of approaching ships, but also provided multiple landing points for determined attackers. Most concerning was the simple matter of numbers. Eldborg's normal garrison consisted of perhaps 20 seasoned fighters, with another 30 men who could bear arms in desperate circumstances. Against Ivar's reported force of 30 or more professional raiders, those odds were manageable but far from comfortable, especially if the enemy had additional allies that the scouts hadn't detected. "We could send for help," Gunnar suggested, joining him at the tower's edge. "Thorvald would come if we asked, and there are other lords who owe you favors from past campaigns." "And how long would that take?" Hroald replied without looking away from the fjord. 3 days minimum for messages to reach them, another day or 2 for them to organize their forces and travel here. Ivar won't give us that long. He knows our situation as well as we do." The strategic reality was stark. They would have to face whatever came with the forces already at hand, relying on defensive advantages and superior knowledge of local conditions to offset their numerical disadvantage. It was not impossible. Hroald had won battles against worse odds, but it would require careful planning and no small amount of luck. "What about the women and children?" Gunnar asked. "We could evacuate them to the high caves, keep them out of harm's way. Some of them, perhaps, but not all will need every pair of hands for the defense, and splitting our forces would make us weaker overall." Hroald turned to face his old friend, seeing his own concerns reflected in scarred features. "Besides, where could they run that Ivar couldn't follow? If he's determined to destroy everything I value, hiding them only delays the inevitable." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Brynja, who climbed the narrow stairs to the tower with careful determination. She had changed from the fine dress she had worn that morning into practical travelling clothes, wool and leather, that would serve well in the chaos of battle. More significantly, she carried a seax at her belt, the short blade showing signs of careful maintenance despite her claims to peaceful intentions. "I've been talking with Astrid about the food stores," she said without preamble. "We have enough supplies for perhaps 2 weeks if we're careful, longer if we ration severely. But that assumes the enemy doesn't find a way to contaminate our water sources." Her practical tone surprised both men. Whatever internal wrestling she had done, since learning about Ivar's threat, she had clearly emerged with a determination to face reality rather than retreat into wishful thinking. Hroald found himself studying her with new appreciation. The woman whose letters had revealed gentle intelligence was proving equally capable of hard pragmatism when circumstances demanded it. "What about the harbour?" she continued. "Could we block it somehow, prevent their ships from landing directly at our pier?" "Possible," Hroald mused, considering the idea. "We could sink a fishing boat in the main channel, force them to land elsewhere, and approach on foot. It wouldn't stop them, but it would slow them down and give us more warning, and more time to rain arrows down on them from the walls," Gunnar added approvingly. "It's not a bad idea. Simple plans are usually the best in desperate circumstances." As the afternoon wore on, the preparations intensified. Every sword and spear in the settlement was sharpened to razor keenness. Arrows were counted and recounted, with fletchers working frantically to increase their supply. The walls were reinforced with additional timber and stone, while the main gates received extra bracing that would force attackers to break through multiple barriers. Perhaps most importantly, every person in the settlement, from the youngest children to the eldest grandparents, was assigned specific roles and responsibilities. Some would fight directly, others would tend the wounded or maintain supplies, and a few would serve as messengers, carrying information between different sections of the defenses. No one would be idle when the attack came, and no one would be ignorant of their part in the overall plan. Through all these preparations, Hroald found himself watching Brynja with growing amazement. She threw herself into the work with quiet competence, moving between different groups to offer assistance wherever it was needed. She helped organize the medical supplies, worked with the women to prepare extra food that could be eaten quickly during battle, and even spent time teaching some of the younger defenders basic techniques for tending wounds. It was while watching her demonstrate proper bandaging techniques to a group of nervous teenagers that Hroald realized how completely his perspective had changed. A week ago, he had been terrified that she would flee after learning about his violent past. Now, with enemies gathering in the northern waters, he was beginning to understand that the gentle woman who had written those letters possessed a core of steel that was only revealed under pressure. That evening, as the settlement settled into the nervous quiet that preceded battle, Brynja sought him out in his private chambers. She found him studying maps by candlelight, trying to anticipate the various approaches Ivar might take and prepare contingencies for each possibility. The war axe hung on the wall above his desk, its polished blade reflecting the flickering flames like a promise of violence to come. "I wanted to thank you," she said simply, settling into the chair across from his desk. "For what?" "For not trying to send me away. For trusting me to make my own choice about staying." She gestured toward the maps spread before him. "And for including me in the preparations, rather than treating me like fragile decoration to be protected." Hroald set down his pen and looked at her properly. In the candlelight, she looked tired but determined, her dark eyes reflecting the same steady resolve that had sustained him through countless difficult campaigns. "You've surprised me," he admitted. "The woman I've seen today bears little resemblance to the sheltered merchant's daughter I expected from your letters. Perhaps because I wrote those letters from a life that was itself sheltered. she replied. "My father protected me from most of the harsh realities of our world. It's only now, facing real danger alongside people I've come to care about, that I'm learning what I'm actually capable of." The words carried implications that neither of them chose to explore directly, but Hroald felt something shift in the space between them. The careful distance that had characterized their interactions since the feast was gradually giving way to something more substantial, not yet love, perhaps, but the foundation upon which love might eventually be built. "There's something I need to tell you," she continued, her voice growing more serious. "Something I've been thinking about since Eric brought word about Ivar's true intentions." Hroald waited, sensing that whatever she was about to say would be important. "I understand now why you made the choice you did 5 years ago. About the prisoners, about refusing mercy to men who had surrendered." She met his eyes directly, her expression steady despite the gravity of her words. "If Ivar succeeds tomorrow, if he destroys everyone I've come to care about in this place, I don't think I would show mercy either. The thought of him hurting Astrid or Gunnar or any of the others, it makes me want things that would have horrified me a month ago." The admission hung between them, like a bridge across the chasm that had separated them since Bjorn's revelation. Hroald reached across the desk to take her hand, feeling the calluses that had formed during her day of preparation work. "I hope you never have to discover what you're truly capable of in such circumstances. But if tomorrow goes badly, if the worst happens, remember that surviving with blood on your hands is still better than not surviving at all." She nodded, squeezing his fingers briefly before pulling away. "I should let you finish your planning. But Hroald, whatever happens tomorrow, I want you to know that I'm grateful for the letters, for the chance to know the man you are beneath all the scars and reputation. That man is worth fighting for." After she left, Hroald sat in silence for a long time, staring at the maps without really seeing them. Tomorrow would bring battle, blood, and quite possibly death. But tonight, for the first time since Brynja's arrival, he felt something approaching peace. Whatever the outcome, they would face it together, not as strangers bound by arrangement, but as two people who had chosen to trust each other with their lives and their hope for the future. Dawn came blood-red across the fjord, painting the water the color of spilled wine and casting long shadows that seemed to promise violence. Hroald had been awake since before first light, making final inspections of the defenses and checking on the morale of his people. The nervous energy that preceded battle hummed through Eldborg like a plucked bowstring, everyone moving with the careful efficiency of those who knew their lives might depend on perfect execution. The lookouts spotted the sails while the morning mist still clung to the water. 3 longships moving in perfect formation up the fjord, their striped sails bright against the grey sky. Ivar had chosen his timing well, arriving with the tide and wind at his back, his approach visible but too close for any meaningful preparation beyond what had already been done. "Impressive ships," Gunnar observed from his position atop the hall's main tower. "Well-maintained, good crews from the way they're handling the wind. This isn't some desperate band of outcasts. These are professional raiders at the height of their skill." Hroald nodded grimly, studying the approaching vessels through the morning light. Each ship carried perhaps a dozen warriors, confirming the intelligence about Ivar's numbers, while offering no pleasant surprises about reduced forces. If anything, the disciplined approach suggested an enemy who had planned this assault with the same careful attention to detail that marked successful military campaigns. The sunken fishing boat in the harbour channel performed exactly as hoped, forcing the raiders to alter their course and seek landing spots along the rocky shoreline rather than driving straight to the wooden pier. The delay was minimal, perhaps a quarter hour, but it provided precious time for final preparations and confirmed that Ivar's forces would have to approach the hall across open ground under arrow fire. As the ships grounded on the shingle beaches, their crews disembarking with practiced efficiency, Hroald caught his first clear glimpse of Ivar's skull splitter in more than a decade. The man had aged, his hair now more grey than brown, and his face bearing the weathered look of someone who had spent years in harsh climates. But his movements retained the fluid grace of a born killer, and the way his men responded to his gestures spoke of absolute authority earned through competence and fear. "Hroald Iron Fist," Ivar's voice carried clearly across the water, pitched to reach the defenders on the walls. "I bring greetings from my brother Ragnar, whose bones still lie on that frozen island where you left them." The formal challenge was expected. Raiders of Ivar's reputation rarely attacked without offering their enemies a chance to understand why they were about to die. But the specific mention of Ragnar confirmed what they had already suspected. This was not about wealth or territory, but about blood and vengeance. "I've come to collect the debt you owe," Ivar continued, his men spreading out along the shoreline in a formation that suggested careful rehearsal. "Not just your life, but everything you value. Your hall will burn, your people will serve new masters, and your bride will learn what happens to women who choose poorly in their affections." The threat against Brynja sent a surge of cold rage through Hroald's chest, but he forced himself to remain calm. Anger was a luxury he couldn't afford, not when so many lives depended on his ability to think clearly and command effectively. Instead, he stepped forward to the wall's edge, making himself visible to the enemy below. "Ivar Skull Splitter," he called back, his own voice carrying the authority of years of command. "Your brother earned his death through his crimes. If you wish to join him, you need only continue your approach." The exchange of challenges was traditional, almost ritualistic, but it served practical purposes as well. Both leaders were studying their opponents, looking for signs of weakness or uncertainty that might be exploited in the coming battle. More importantly, they were giving their followers time to prepare mentally for the violence ahead. Warriors fought better when they understood what they were fighting for. "You speak of justice," Ivar replied, beginning to advance up the slope toward the hall with his men spreading out on either flank. "But justice would have been a clean death in honest battle. Instead, you executed bound prisoners like a butcher slaughtering sheep." "I executed murderers who deserved no better," Hroald shot back. "Men who killed innocents and took pleasure in their suffering. If that troubles your conscience, perhaps you should reconsider the company you keep." The verbal sparring continued as the raiders approached, but Hroald's attention was increasingly focused on their tactical deployment. Ivar was no fool. He was advancing his main force directly toward the gates, while sending smaller groups to probe for weaknesses in the side walls. It was a sound strategy that would force the defenders to spread their strength and prevent them from concentrating overwhelming force at any single point. "Archers ready," Hroald called quietly to his men, watching as the raiders moved into optimal range. The first volleys would be crucial. They needed to inflict maximum casualties before the enemy could close to melee range, where numbers would matter more than defensive position. The morning air filled with the whistle of arrows and the beginning screams of battle as two old enemies finally settled their blood debt in the shadow of the northern mountains. The first flight of arrows darkened the morning sky like a cloud of angry hornets, their whistling passage followed by the wet thud of iron points finding flesh and the harsh cries of wounded men. Hroald's archers had chosen their targets well. 3 of Ivar's raiders went down in the initial volley, while several others stumbled with arrows protruding from non-fatal but debilitating wounds. But Ivar's men were veterans of countless raids, accustomed to fighting under adverse conditions. They responded to the arrow storm with practiced efficiency, raising shields to deflect the worst of the barrage, while continuing their advance up the slope. Their own archers returned fire from behind improvised cover, forcing the defenders to duck behind the timber battlements. "Gates," Gunnar shouted from his position overlooking the main approach. "They're bringing up a ram." Hroald cursed silently as he spotted the makeshift battering ram, a section of ship's mast that Ivar's men had prepared for exactly this purpose. The gates of Eldborg were strong, but not designed to withstand sustained assault by determined attackers. If the raiders succeeded in breaking through, the battle would quickly become a bloody melee in the courtyard where numbers would tell. "Pour everything you have on that ram crew," he commanded, watching as his archers shifted their aim toward the most immediate threat. "Don't let them reach the gates." The next few minutes became a desperate race between destruction and defense. Ivar's warriors pushed forward with their improvised ram, while arrows fell around them like deadly rain. 2 men dropped, then a third, but their companions immediately stepped forward to take their places. The coordinated effort spoke of careful planning and absolute determination to succeed regardless of cost. Meanwhile, other groups of raiders had reached the side walls and were attempting to scale them using grappling hooks and crude ladders. The defenders met these attempts with spears and swords, stabbing down at climbers who exposed themselves with each upward reach. Bodies began to pile at the base of the walls, but more attackers kept coming, accepting casualties as the price of eventual victory. A tremendous crash echoed across the courtyard as the battering rams struck the main gates for the first time. The sound sent a shiver through the assembled defenders. Not fear, exactly, but the recognition that the final phase of the battle had begun. Another crash followed, then another, each impact accompanied by the splintering of wood and the gradual weakening of barriers that had stood for generations. There, through the west wall, someone screamed from across the courtyard. 5 or 6 of them, moving toward the hall. Hroald felt the familiar weight of command decisions pressing down on him. He could reinforce the breach and risk leaving the gates undermanned, or maintain focus on the main attack and allow a small group of enemies to penetrate his inner defenses. Either choice carried terrible risks, but hesitation would guarantee failure. "Brynja," he called to where she stood with a group of women armed with kitchen knives and improvised weapons. "Take your people and seal that breach. Don't try to fight them directly, just delay them until we can send help." She nodded grimly and led her small group toward the compromised section of wall, moving with the determined gait of someone who understood that retreat was not an option. Hroald watched her go with a mixture of pride and terror, knowing that he was sending the woman he had come to love into mortal danger, but having no alternative if the defense was to hold. The gates finally gave way with a sound like thunder, splintering inward in a shower of broken timber and twisted iron. Ivar himself led the charge through the breach, his massive war axe gleaming in the morning light as he cut down the first defender to meet him. Behind him came his best warriors, screaming battle cries that echoed off the surrounding buildings. "Form up! Shield wall!" Hroald commanded, dropping down from the walls to meet the assault personally. This was the moment when leadership meant standing in the front rank, when all the strategic planning in the world mattered less than raw courage and skill at arms. The two forces met with a crash that seemed to shake the earth itself. Steel rang against steel as veteran warriors tested each other's skill and determination. Hroald found himself face to face with Ivar across the chaos of battle, the two leaders circling each other like wolves while their followers fought and died around them. At last, Ivar growled, hefting his axe with practiced ease. 5 years I've waited for this moment, 5 years of dreaming about the look in your eyes when everything you value turns to ash." "Then stop talking and finish it," Hroald replied, raising his own weapon in response. Around them, the battle raged with desperate intensity. But for these 2 men, the rest of the world had narrowed to the space between their blades and the old grievance that could only be settled in blood. The final confrontation had begun. The duel between Hroald and Ivar unfolded, with the deadly precision of masters who had spent lifetimes perfecting their craft. Both men were scarred veterans of countless battles, their movements economical and purposeful as they tested each other's defenses. Around them, the larger battle continued to rage, but the outcome of that struggle would be determined by which of these 2 leaders emerged victorious. Ivar struck first, his axe whistling through the air in a vicious overhead swing that would have split a lesser man from crown to chest. Hroald deflected the blow with his own weapon, the impact sending vibrations up his arms as steel met steel in a shower of sparks. He countered immediately with a horizontal cut aimed at Ivar's ribs, but the raider leader twisted aside with surprising agility for a man his size. "You've grown slow in your comfortable hall," Ivar taunted, circling to his left while looking for an opening. "Too much soft living, too little honest fighting. And you've grown careless in your need for revenge," Hroald replied calmly, noting how Ivar favored his left leg slightly, an old wound that might prove exploitable. "Hate makes men predictable." The observation proved accurate. Ivar's next. The assault came with the wild fury of a man driven more by emotion than strategy, a flurry of blows that Hroald weathered through superior positioning and patient defense. When the raider overextended himself on a particularly vicious swing, Hroald stepped inside his guard and drove an elbow into his opponent's jaw with bone-crushing force. Ivar staggered backward, blood streaming from his mouth, but he recovered quickly enough to parry Hroald's follow-up attack. The two men separated, both breathing heavily now, both beginning to show the effects of sustained combat. Around them, the sounds of fighting were gradually diminishing as the larger battle reached its conclusion. "Your people are losing," Ivar observed, gesturing toward where the last pocket of raiders was being overwhelmed by Gunnar's counterattack. "But it doesn't matter, killing you will be victory enough." Hroald risked a quick glance toward where Brynja had led her small group to defend the breach in the west wall. Relief flooded through him as he saw her still standing, bloodied but alive, directing the final mopping-up operations against the raiders who had penetrated the inner defenses. She had proven herself in battle as thoroughly as she had proven herself in their quiet conversations. The momentary distraction nearly cost him his life. Ivar's axe passed so close to his head that he felt the wind of its passage, the blade embedding itself in the wooden post beside him with tremendous force. But the raider's weapon stuck fast, giving Hroald the opening he had been waiting for. His own axe took Ivar in the side, biting deep through mail and flesh to find the vital organs beneath. The raider leader's eyes widened in surprise and pain, his grip on his weapon loosening as strength flowed out of him with his lifeblood. He sank to his knees in the muddy courtyard, one hand pressed against the mortal wound while the other reached toward his fallen axe. "My brother," Ivar began, his voice already growing weak. "Your brother earned his death," Hroald said firmly but without malice. "As did you. The blood debt is paid." Ivar's final breath rattled in his throat as he toppled forward onto the scarred earth of Eldborg's courtyard. Around him, the last sounds of combat faded into the groans of wounded men and the crackling of fires that had been set during the assault. The battle was over, the raiders defeated, the hall secured, but victory had come at a cost. 7 of Eldborg's defenders lay dead among the enemy corpses, including young Olaf, the blacksmith's son, who had died defending the gates with a courage that would be remembered in songs. Twice that number bore wounds that would mark them for life, though most would heal given time and care. Hroald found Brynja tending to the wounded in the hall's main chamber, her hands steady as she cleaned and bandaged injuries that would have turned a gentler woman's stomach. She looked up as he approached, her dark eyes searching his face for signs of serious injury before settling into relief at finding him whole. "It's finished?" she asked simply. "It's finished." He settled onto the bench beside her, suddenly feeling every one of his 50 summers in the ache of battered muscles and strained joints. Ivar is dead, his men scattered or surrendered, the threat is ended. She nodded, returning her attention to the wounded warrior whose arm she was binding. But he could see something different in her manner, a quiet satisfaction that spoke of a woman who had discovered reserves of strength she hadn't known she possessed. "What happens now?" she asked, as she tied off the bandage and moved to the next patient. "Now we rebuild, repair the gates, tend the wounded, honor the dead." He watched her work, marveling at the competence she displayed in tasks no merchant's daughter should have known. "And we decide what kind of future we want to build together." She paused in her work to look at him, directly, and he saw something in her expression that had been missing since the night of the feast. The warmth and trust that had characterized their correspondence, tempered now by shared experience and mutual respect. "Together," she repeated thoughtfully. "I like the sound of that." Outside, the fjord stretched peaceful and blue under the afternoon sun, its waters already washing away the last traces of the morning's violence. Ships would come and go as they always had, carrying traders and travelers between distant lands. But for the first time in years, Hroald felt no urge to watch for approaching sails with suspicion or dread. The past was finally laid to rest, buried with Ivar's bones in northern soil. What remained was the future, uncertain as all futures were, but bright with the possibility of love tested by fire and proven strong enough to endure whatever challenges might come. In her gentle hands, even his war-scarred heart might finally find peace.